Today I'm digging into my holiday fabric scraps, some I thrifted a few weeks ago and some that have been quietly living in my stash for years. There's no big plan, just scrap busting, enjoying a quiet cozy day, and seeing what happens when I let the fabrics tell the story. Hi friends, welcome back. Do you ever start a project with the intention of making something and you get halfway through it and you realize you've made something completely different? Well, that was the case in this project, and I'll just tell you that I was pleasantly surprised with the outcome. If you remember, a couple weeks ago, I thrifted this $2 bag of scrap holiday fabric, which has been this amazing find that just keeps on giving. I made this mini quilt a couple weeks ago, which was super fun, and I loved using the interfacing patchwork method. That was really fun. But today I'm going to try something a little different. Today I'm going to be using up some of the scrap fabric that I have had in my stash for ages. It's lovely fabric. I just haven't used it all up. And I'm also going to be using some of the 1.5 inch strips. Yeah, 1.5 inch strips of fabric that I thrifted in this $2 grab bag. So grab yourself some tea and get yourself a project because today is a good one and you should craft along with me. The first thing that I did for this project is I gathered all of my holiday scrap fabric, I ironed it, and I laid it all out to see what I had. Since I had about 5 or 6 of these long 1.5 inch strips, I decided to start by sewing those all together. Because I didn't really have any intention when I first started this project, I didn't even bother cutting the strips to the same size. I just put the right sides together and started sewing. For the entirety of this project, I am using a 1/4 inch seam and all of the right sides are sewn together first. I press and then I sew the next strip on. When I first started out, I didn't really have an exact plan of how I wanted to sew everything together, but what I did know is that I wanted the lights and the darks to stand out. So I started sewing light fabrics to dark fabrics and then light fabrics again. Thankfully, there was enough contrast in the strips that I had, so I didn't have to cut anything else out. You've probably also noticed that I haven't pinned or clipped any of the fabric together, and that's because I have this little magnetic seam guide that I purchased a little while ago. It has ended up being one of my favorite little tools that I've purchased this year. And if you're looking for a seam guide or to make your sewing projects a little bit easier, especially when you're just doing this sort of free form, flowy type of project and you just want to sew a strip that's really straight, I definitely recommend this seam guide. There'll be a link for this exact one in the description. Once I was finished sewing all of the 1.5 inch strips together, I took it over to my pressing table, pressed all the seams to one side, and then started cutting. Since all of the 8 strips sewn together were 7 inches wide, I decided to cut those into 7 by 7 inch squares, and then just to make things even more interesting, I cut that into triangles. From all the strips, I got 4 7-inch right angle triangles, and then I got this other little extra bit that I don't know what I'm going to do with. This was just the offcut that I thought was sort of interesting looking, and we'll probably use it to stuff something later. Next, I went back to my stash and started cutting 7 by 7 inch right angle triangles so that I would have a couple of matching triangles to counteract the chaos of the strips. I've got this lovely green and white snowflake pattern that I purchased a long time ago, I think from Joann's. I also had some of this plain green that I thought would go good with all of the strips as well. It's about the same color as the poinsettia green. Once I had 4 triangles cut, I meticulously pinned these all together and then brought them over to my sewing machine to sew them into 4 squares. I'm once again using my magnetic seam guide to get perfect 1/4 inch seams on all of these squares. I was really liking how this project was coming along and how the strips sort of contrasted with these more larger triangles. After I was finished sewing these squares together, I brought them over to my table and I did a little bit of a mock-up. I liked how the larger triangles were in the center forming an hourglass shape and how the strips were sort of just framing that in on the outside. So I decided to roll with it and sewed all 4 squares together. I chain stitched 2 of them together, then I took them over to my pressing table, pressed the seams to opposite sides, and then nested them together to form a big square. When I'm patchworking squares that have a lot of different seams in them together, I prefer to press the seams to opposite sides because I find that when you nest the seams together, where one seam is going to one side and one seam is pressed to the other side, it just makes a better point in the middle. It's just a little cleaner, and it's one of those hacks that I've picked up along this quilting journey. If you're loving this content, I'd love for you to join my weekly newsletter. It's about a 3 to 4 minute read each week where I fill you in on what's happening behind the scenes here at Katie Cat Studio. I catch you up on any content you may have missed, and I have a recommendation of the week. Usually, I review and recommend a sewing or crafting tool, but sometimes I even recommend a book that I just finished. I love reading and also listening to audiobooks when I'm here in the studio, and I just want to share my joy of reading and listening along with you. If all that sounds interesting, there's a link in the description of this video to join my newsletter. It's free, it'll always be free, and it's just a little way of me being able to connect with you. Once I had all 4 of the smaller squares sewn together into one large square, I actually added 2 different borders, a red one and a green one. However, I completely forgot to film them. So we're just going to jump a little bit ahead in the process where I am adding the backing and the batting and basting them together. I just purchased these no-name basting pins. They look exactly like safety pins, but they're bent in a way that makes it easy to baste your quilt together. Okay, I am trying to decide whether or not it's a crazy idea to hand sew this. I mean, it's small enough that I could probably hand sew it over the weekend. And I was thinking even like a snowflake could go in the middle. Um, and I'm trying to think about this more in the terms of like, okay, well, I know how to embroider, so I'm sure I can do some hand sewing and make it really pretty. But I may hate it in the end. I don't know. I really do want to sort of finish this so I can move on to my next project, but I also want this to be different. I want it to be really pretty, and I was thinking that hand sewing this might be better. I just got these new basting pins here, and they're like bent, and they were really easy to put in. They're not quite like safety pins. They're very much more the basting pins, and so I just basted this. I don't know. I can't decide. I think I'm gonna go for it. Okay, so spoiler alert, I went for it and I absolutely hated how it was turning out. I wanted the back to look just as nice as the front, and doing these back stitches, it just turned out awful. So I chickened out and I decided to quilt this little mini quilt the same way I had done my previous quilts. I'm using my regular foot because I still haven't figured out how to get my walking foot attached to my industrial juki, but it does have this arm on it that is measured out to 1.5 inches, which allows me to sew very straight perpendicular lines throughout the entirety of my quilt. I started quilting in the middle of the quilt. I sewed one long line and then I just did consecutive lines 1.5 inches apart for the entirety of the quilt. Once I was finished quilting all the lines in one direction, I flipped the quilt around and did perpendicular lines so that I formed these 1.5 inch squares. Once I was happy and finished with all of the quilting, the only thing left on my list was to make the binding and to put the binding on. I sewed together a couple of these 2.5-inch wide strips of red and white fabric, pressed down the middle, and then I attached it to the front of the quilt. I am still really new at putting bindings on, and so I'm not going to do a tutorial here, but I will say that I am sewing this with a 1/4-inch seam on the front, and then once I was done all the way around the quilt, I flipped it over to the other side, pinned it, and then sewed it from the front side so that the seam on the front looked nice. I periodically checked to make sure that I was actually sewing on the back, and I just kept on going. Even if some of the bits and pieces were sticking out, I just fixed that in the end. If you got a better method of doing this, I'd love to hear in the comments. Now that I'm all finished, time for the reveal. I love how this super cute little mini quilt turned out. And, you know, I wouldn't really change much about it. I really wish I was better at hand sewing because I did really want to make like a design in the middle, like a snowflake or something really like Christmassy, wintry, something cute. But if you remember earlier, it just didn't turn out the way that I wanted it to, so I ditched that, and I just did the normal quilting method that I've been using for the last couple of quilts that I've done. It's just a 1.5-inch square where I do all the lines parallel with 1.5 inches, and then I do all the perpendicular lines 1.5 inches, which makes this cute little grid pattern. And I love how it turned out as the grid on the back. The one thing that was really difficult was the binding. I think I need to go back to the basics with the bindings and uh, get my measurements right and just take a little bit more time. Maybe it was harder to do the binding this time because the fabric was thicker. Like this red and white fabric is a little bit thicker than just like the typical quilting cotton. So I think that might have played a role in it being difficult. Also, maybe I wasn't being as precise with my sewing as I should have been. I meant to be sewing at a 1/4 inch, but maybe I should have been sewing at something else, something smaller or bigger. I'm not quite sure. So the binding, it's not as pretty as I would like it to be, but it's a work in progress. My whole quilting is a work in progress. One thing that I do really love about this is this red border and then the glittery pine cone border. This is one of my favorite fabrics, the glittery pine cones, and I got that new from Joann's years ago. Rest in peace, Joanne. And also at the same time, I got this green and white fabric. It's amazing how you remember when you get fabric. You can have hundreds of different uh, fabrics in your stash and you remember where you got all of them. The green one, I think I thrifted that. All of these are thrifted. This was in the grab bag, and then the pine cones was from Joann's. The red and white, thrifted, I think maybe at Goodwill Outlet bins. And then this plaid was also from that same one by Joann's a couple years ago where I bought a whole bunch of holiday fabric. So I can say that I'm super proud that I have been using up my holiday stash. The grab bag, the $2 grab bag is getting smaller. There's quite a few pieces left. There's a lot more projects left. I could make maybe 2 or 3 more mini quilts even if I wanted to, I think. Or ornaments, lots of ornaments. But overall, I'm super proud of this. I don't think I would sell it because there's so many mistakes in it, but for me, it's perfect. If you liked this video, I'd love it if you gave it a like or if you left me a comment. Let me know in the comments actually if you've been making your own mini quilts and if you've been doing some scrap busting. I know a lot of us have so many holiday fabrics in our stash. So it's really important to work through those fabrics every once in a while, either with smaller projects like this or like ornaments or even larger quilts. Holiday quilts are really fun, especially for using up all those scraps. And I would love to know what projects you've been making. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and remember, done is better than perfect.